All right, guys, the SWICK has finally become a reality. I just received these. I was part of the Kickstarter, one of the 954 contributors to support the Kickstarter for this. And I got to tell you, right up front, they turned out great. What I'd like to tell you, though, is I'm going to do this as a two-parter. I'm first going to do the review, and then I'll end the video. I'll tell you how you can win the free giveaways, and that would be these two guys, how to register. And then I'll end the video, and then I'll append what I'm going to call a process review or a hot wash on the end, where I talk about all of the difficulties that this Kickstarter experienced in producing this. So if you're only interested in the review, as soon as I tell you how to win, you can end the video, and that'll be it. If you're interested in the rest of it, stick around, and we'll talk about it. All right. I got to tell you, I am very impressed with these. I've been playing with them for the past several days. I've been picking locks with them, and these are quite different than the original prototype that I received 2 years ago for a review. If you'd like to take a look at the original prototypes, you can compare it. I'll put the link down there. It's been, as I said, 2 years, and I got to say it was well worth the wait, particularly when 1 full year was basically a pandemic. All right, one of the things that they did after the first review of their prototype is that Dave and James asked the Locksport community for improvements. How can we make our product better? And we're going to take all these good ideas, incorporate them into the final design. Yeah, one of the things you guys asked for, if you recall, we had one single top of the Keyway Tensioner, and you guys asked for another one. So we have on one side here, we have a 40,000 top of the Keyway Tensioner. And there's a little thumb groove, you can get your finger under it. So 40,000th on this side, and if you flip it over where the logo used to be, there's a 50,000th on this side. So we got a 1 millimeter and a 1.2 millimeter in this guy. The original version used to be a compression fit, which really wasn't all that great. And then they put a single magnet in there, which was okay, but it still tended to occasionally lose the tension wrench. They've incorporated now 2 magnets, so it fits in there perfectly now, and there's absolutely no chance with 2 of those little very strong super magnets, they are not going to be falling out of there. So they took your idea, and now we have all of our top of the Keyway tensioners in the side of this guy. It's, as I said, it's very compact as well, so very cool. Here's my normal everyday carry pocket knife. So just to give you an idea, it is very compact. It's not quite as thin, but I've only got 1 blade, and inside of here, we have 12 blades. Now, the original prototype had 10. You guys said, I mean, why do you never say, okay, you got 10, we'll settle for 8. Just make it with 8. No, it's always more. Well, we got more now. And now there are a total of 12 blades, and this is what they look like. These are a tremendous improvement over the original pick designs. I'll overlay a picture showing what they were. And I think you'll agree that most of those original pick profiles were kind of obscure. They looked more like, well, more like dental instruments than lock picks. They were okay, they were functional, but James and Dave took your advice, and they went to Christina Palmer, one of the preeminent pick designers on the planet Earth, and said, can you help us with coming up with a good selection of profiles? Christina spent quite a while, and this is what she came up with. Almost all of these, well, maybe not all of them, but a good number are her own designs. She decided to include a probe because you can use that not only for bypassing unshielded locks, you can use it for resetting some of the Schlage locks, some of the quickset locks. You can use it to move sliders, all kinds of things you can do with the probe. So good thing to have. And then she included, these are basically the Wonder Rakes, or the quad, so 4 humps, and then a double of that same frequency, and then the quint, or 5 humps, and again a double of that same frequency. And then we have a deep hook, medium hook, and then a short hook, and then we have a fine tipped short hook for reaching those really fine, really narrow profiles. And then we have a half diamond, so if you want to pick a dimple lock, I guess it's possible with that, or it's also an excellent rake. And then next to it, my favorite pick, which by the way, Christina almost left out, but did it because she knew I and a lot of you guys would complain, a DeForest half diamond. And then we have basically a fall hook. So a really neat tool to have if you're picking high security locks, particularly things like medicos, where you need to reach in there and rotate those pins to the right angle before you raise them to the correct height. So total of 12 pick tips and an excellent selection of those. Great improvement. Another thing that may not be visible to you is that these used to be made out of, well, I can't even remember. It was stainless steel, but it wasn't a top grade. they increased the quality of the stainless steel as well. So now this is all 301 high yield stainless steel. One of Christina Palmer's favorite steels because very, very durable, lasts a long time. Very tough material. It's kind of difficult to find though. And to find a manufacturer to sell at the quantities they needed, it took them several months to do. But anyway, we'll get into that when we get into the hot wash. So you got upgraded both on the pick profiles and on the material itself. You'll also notice I've got a lanyard attached to this one. It doesn't come with that, but there's a little lanyard hole that they put into the body there. You can see it, and a lanyard goes on there. You guys requested it. They incorporated it into the design. So just a great job. When we get over to here, they ran into, I don't want to call it a problem, but they needed a workaround because they took two of the top of the keyway wrenches that used to fit in the top, and then they put them into the side, which left extra room up in the top there. So here's what we're looking at. We still have our top, or our bottom of the keyway tensioner, so we have a large one on top. So let's pull that guy out. And then we have a plastic 3D printed spacer, which seems to me personally like a workaround. And the reason that spacer's in there is because without the top of the keyway in there, there's extra room. And then below that is another very small bottom of the keyway tensioner. If you guys recall, there used to be, well, there still is kind of a, they call it a secret slot down here. Now, because of the redesign, you guys wanted a very solid lockup. And believe me, there is a super lock. It's very difficult to pull these guys up. That spring in there is super strong. You flip down the one you need, and then you pop the rest of them back in place, and that is super solid. You wanted it to lock up solidly without having to use a knurled knob or a wing nut or anything on the side because you thought that would be inconvenient. That took a complete redesign of the internal part, the recoil spring that locks everything in place, to include the notch on the picks themselves. So Christina Palmer took care of that, and we got exactly what you guys asked for. But the thing is, because of the increased curvature of the internal spring and the thickness of it, that secret slot, while it looks like it still exists, it only goes in there about 1/2 inch. So it's still there. They may eventually find a way to open that back up, but for right now, the things that used to go in there no longer fit. And the things that used to go in there are right here. And these were included with my SWICK. You got a couple of spiral extractors, and then you have a very thin, I think it's a 5,000 shim for decoating and shimming things open. But there's a workaround. What I found is you can take your shim, you can throw that guy in there. You can take your small tensioner, you can throw him in there. You can take your two spiral extractors, put them in brass end first, just slide those guys in there like that. And then you can take your large tensioner and wedge him in there and fit him in place. Get up there. And everything's going to be held in place. It's not going to be falling out of there. So very cool. It's just kind of a workaround. You just got to make do with it. Anyway, guys, this is expected to cost, they don't have the final price on these yet. They're going to have everything available to the public well within a month. They want to first fulfill all the people who back them on their Kickstarter. They had, as I said, 954 of these to produce for their Kickstarter supporters. They've supplied about 90 or 90% of the people so far. So very soon, these are going to go up for sale for around $70 on their website. I'll put their website down there. By the way, full disclosure, I am not affiliated with them in any way. I get no kickback, no benefit of any way other than supporting a couple of guys who produced what I think is a great little product. All right, that is the review. If you'd like to win one of these are the two giveaways. Stick around. I'll tell you how to register. Appreciate your time, guys. Stay safe, stay legal. If you want to stick around for the hot wash, wait until after the closing credits. And we will talk about some of the problems that they ran into with SWICK and a couple other Kickstarters. Maybe it'll save you guys a little bit of pain if you're thinking about it yourself. All you need to do is navigate to locklab.com, the tribal website, and scroll down in the middle of the page. You'll see all the giveaway buttons, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But the one you're looking for is the weekend review giveaway, purple band. Just click on it. It'll take you to the registration page. Again, scroll to the bottom, put in a good email address. So if you win, I can get in touch with you, let you know. Put in a username, doesn't matter what it is, and click Submit. When you're done, you'll get a green check mark confirming your entry. Thanks, guys. All right, I know there's a lot of creativity out there, a lot of innovation among you guys. And the way I know that is at least once a week, someone will come to me with an idea for, inviting me to participate in some level of a new product. And 100% of the time, I turn them down. And it's not just because I'm a dick. I mean, I am. Anybody will tell you that. But it's because I have invested in 14 different Kickstarters over the last 10 years. And I've noticed a lot of common threads. Of the 14 Kickstarters, 6 of them have ended in total failure, total loss of the money, no product ever delivered, just basically drop off of the planet Earth. The others have been successful, but there are common threads among all of them. And I thought it'd be important to talk about that because those common threads are not, SWICK is not alone. Those common threads are shared among all of the successful ones. First thing I'd like to talk about is the engineer's rule. Now, you guys know I'm a mechanical engineer. Engineers have a rule that says when somebody comes to you with a project, you take their estimates, whether it's cost or time, and you double it. And then once you got that number, you double it again. So basically, all of their estimates multiply them by 4. And when the project is finally done and the product is delivered to the customer, that will probably be very close to the truth of the true cost of the whole project. So in the case of SWICK, let's take a look at this. If you guys recall, if you go back and look at their Kickstarter page, SWICK originally said, we need $30,000 and we can produce this thing in 6 months. So let's take a look at that. 30,000. They had 954 investors, and they ended up collecting quite a bit more than 30. They got $59,364, I think it was. So a little over 59,000. And I've broken up the SWICK into 3 subcomponents. Now, there's a 4th component that I will talk about, but I can't show it on the screen. It's a psychological element. So the first element is right here. This is the first thing that they were kind of tackling, and that was the handle. By the time they were finished with this handle, the $59,000 plus some personal savings from both of these gentlemen was gone. They had only done the handle, and 100+% of their investment was gone. And at that point, most Kickstarters make a decision. Do we keep digging into our savings account? Do we look for more investors, or do we declare failure? In the case of SWICK, they decided to keep going. Phase 2, right here, are the picks. Now, this, in order to fund this, Dave took a personal home equity loan, personal loan, for $50,000 to fund this, thinking that $50,000 was going to get him through everything to produce and get him to the finish line. They didn't know it then, but again, with perfect hindsight, we can do the math, and that additional $50,000 got them through the picks, leaving the rest of it unfunded. So again, a trip to the bank, another home equity loan, and by now we've got like $150,000 invested in everything that you see. $150,000 is, to me, a lot of money. When you figure out that they were only producing 1,000 units, that's $150 per initial unit for the first 1,000 units. So those of you who invested, 954 guys, $59,364, it works out to $62 each on average. So those of you who invested $62 actually made a $90 profit, because your reward for taking that risk is one of these $150 initial units. I know that's a weird way to look at it. Hopefully the final product will come nowhere near costing that as they start to spread it out. But the fact of the matter is, the initial SWICK you have in your hand cost these guys $150. So let's take a look. Where did that 2 years go? And where did that $150,000 get invested in order to produce this final product? First, let's take a look at the handles. All right, let's first talk about the injection molded handles. Obviously, injection molded means you're molding them. You need to have a mold made. As we go on, you'll discover there's quite a bit of precision in the manufacture of this thing. So if the mold is screwed up initially, if you don't get your measurements or your plans right, then the molds are not going to fit the hardware. Also, if you have the molds made early and then later there's some design change, it may or may not fit the mold. These guys discovered that when it came to the tensioners. The tensioner fits right here in this groove. And as time went on, the tensioner became more and more stiffer and stiffer, more and more pressure on it. Now, if you take a look at this guy, This used to be the secret compartment. It would extend all the way down here where all of those extractors could fit. The problem is, as pressure was put on it, more and more pressure to keep that solid lock that they were trying to achieve, that hollow compartment, there was just a thin wall of plastic that was collapsing. So they had to completely change the mold to fill that in, to give it the strength necessary. Again, you don't discover that until it's too late. In looking at the after action report on the Kickstarter and their updates, I would estimate that they had between 3 and 4 separate molds made. Now, sometimes your existing mold, if it's a small minor change, they can machine the molds and you can just reuse them. But more often than not, it's a major design change like this guy, which we'll talk about. Yeah, completely new mold. Each mold takes about 6 weeks from the time you order it to be delivered and costs many, many, many thousands of dollars. That's why the first $50-some-odd thousand got expended on just the molds themselves. All right, another part of the project with unforeseen difficulties were producing these tips. Now, I will tell you that the design of all the tips was done by Christina Palmer, completely free. She volunteered all of her time for that. And we ended up with some great tips, but some things you may not be aware of unless you've really been paying attention. First of all, these are all in 301 high-yield stainless steel, which is a very significant upgrade from the initial material on the prototype. These guys were trying to source this material during a pandemic. So from the time they committed to using the high yield until they were able to find a dealer and get things delivered, their cost on the raw material alone had gone up 4-fold. So quite a significant and unexpected increase in their cost. They had these all laser cut, which gives you a very, very nice cut, a very nice finish. And they were smart about it. They ordered some initial prototypes, a very small run, probably 100 tips. Ended up costing them $15 a tip so they could get these prototypes, put them together, and make sure everything worked. And it's really lucky that they did that for a couple reasons. Well, first of all, when they were delivered, the initial tips, the prototype tips were absolutely perfect. They'd been well tumbled, they'd been hand finished, there were no blemishes of any kind on them. So there was a hidden defect that they weren't aware of that would show up and rear its ugly head later. Anyway, when they put them in there, they discovered very quickly there were some critical measurements on here. They knew they were critical, but I don't think they realized they knew how critical they were going to be. First of all was going to be this bearing surface. Remember, we wanted a solid lockup, and this is the tension spring. It had to fit in there just perfectly to a certain length. Any less than that, and the tip would get wobbly. Any more than that, then the hole would be off-center and it wouldn't pivot correctly. So the measurements here were very, very critical. As it turned out, they were right. They had to be modified later when the spring changed. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they got that part right. So they bulk ordered all of their kits, all of their tips. And 1,000 units, 12 picks each, that's 12,000 and some extras. So about 14,000 tips. They got them a much less price than $15 each, obviously. But when they arrived, they weren't finished nearly as nicely as the pieces provided for the prototype. And I'm going to try to overlay the picture, but what would happen is when you laser cut these out of a large sheet, if you don't leave them attached in 1 or 2 places, as soon as you finish cutting through it, it'll fall onto the floor, and then you got to pick them all up. So the way you get around that is you leave a little tit, and it's not here right now because this one's been filed off, but you can barely see the remnant of the attachment tit that was right here. And oddly, why they did this, I don't know, but the laser cutting company also put an internal tit right there in one of the most critical measurements of all, the pivot point. So when these arrived, it had a giant bag full of 12,000 plus tips. They all had little tits that had to be hand removed. So quite a disappointment. So when you take a look at this, this is where the pivot pin goes. There is no slop. I mean, that is a very precise fit. So you had to do a really good job of reaming that out, and you had to remove that little tit from the back because if you didn't, remember it's back there, when this was in the up position, when it started to rotate, that little tip would catch on the tensioner, and one of 2 things would happen. The tip would break or bend, or More importantly, if this wasn't tempered correctly, the tension spring was breaking. So they absolutely had to hand remove all those. 12,000 plus tips. Takes about 30 seconds to hand finish each of them. Times 12,000, 6,000 minutes. Do the math. That's 12.5 man days sitting there sanding all those off so that everything will fit when you decide to put it all together. This is where the time was free. The guys volunteered their own time to do that, but the cost of this pile right here was another $50,000. Totally unexpected. The next biggie is this guy. All right, I know it doesn't look like much, but this little tensioner is probably one of the biggest time sucks of the entire project. It looks very, very innocent, just a simple chunk of steel, but we'll start from the beginning. In the prototype, this was made out of a much thinner piece of stainless steel. It was much narrower in this dimension as well because there were only 10 picks. But with 12, you needed to maintain a lot more tension, and I don't think they realized that until late in the game. They had to really beef this piece up, and once they beefed it up, it wouldn't fit into the existing groove of one of the molds, which necessitated a new mold being, or at least a mold being modified in order to fit it. So that's how that dude fits in there, very tight. And you notice it's not perfectly straight. There's a little bit of an upturn here. And again, this is all trial and error. It's not really something you can calculate. And that's because this is where your pick goes and it fits up there just like that. Now the thing is, this is a piece of spring steel. They tried about 20 different versions of stainless steel and could not get that material to work. Wouldn't take the hardening, and it being too soft. They couldn't get it hardened, so after a while it would lose its rigidity, and then your pick tip started to flop around. And they did this by building it and then opening and closing the picks thousands of times manually, and then they discovered that wasn't going to work. Ultimately, they went with, if they'd asked a metallurgist, a piece of, get this, spring steel designed specifically for this. They had to get the dimensions right, obviously, to maintain the right amount of tension. Now, you notice this guy is not straight. It's got a little bit of an upturn right here. Doesn't look like much, but that is absolutely critical. If that upturn is too much, as they discovered, you couldn't open or close the pick blades, and if you did, you would generally bend the pick tips, break the pick tips through these little pieces here, or because these are hardened steel, they are a little bit brittle, they would end up breaking right about there. So the level of bend, the amount of bend, and the level of hardness was absolutely critical, and I don't think they realized that either over time. The measurements on this are just absolutely precise. It has to be absolutely perfect. So what do? Well, you get the metal before it's hardened, you pre-bend it to the exact angle using a jig, and then you send it into a metal hardener. And what they discovered is that in the hardening process, that flex tended to change. It heated unevenly. Sometimes the bend would be a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Different batches of steel hardened at different rates, so some of them were more brittle than others. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is there were a lot of rejects. So out of every 10 pieces, probably 2 of them didn't work, were unusable. They were either too brittle, they broke after assembly, means you had to take it back apart, put it back together, or they would just totally fail. So they finally got the recipe for this tiny bit of steel perfect, and that's what we got today. That took a lot of time. They went through, like I said, 20 different versions at least of finding the right tensioning piece. Seems like a small thing, but hard to see before you begin this little game. These tensioners were cut locally. Again, totally, it's just 50,000 and 40,000 thick steel, very easy to cut, but you notice it's kind of unique dimensions. And the reason they had to have these custom cut is because this is a commercial one. This one happens to be multi-pick, but it's the same as all of the others. When you try to put it in that groove, the small end pretty much fits, but the big end is just a little bit too long. Again, a little bit of foresight, it would have made the tool bigger, or you could have perhaps angled it slightly differently to use a commercial wrench instead of having some custom cut, which turned out to be quite expensive, more expensive than originally expected. The last item, the last speed bump, is this guy. And I know these look so simple. When I heard they were having trouble with these, I simply couldn't believe it. But they did, and here's why. These guys fit inside of here just like that. Now, they couldn't take a commercially available product because they wouldn't fit. They'd have to be modified. So they had to have these custom cut. And you notice it fits into the length perfectly. Anything longer, obviously not going to fit. Anything shorter, you guys get pissed off, and it wouldn't compress correctly against the end here to prevent itself, from falling out when everything was together. So they had to send out bids to have these made by several major lock-making companies. The cheapest bid they got initially, get this, for the first 1,000 pairs of these, $45,000. I can only imagine how heartbreaking that was because, you're so near the end. You've done all the hard stuff. All the R&D is done. You got everything perfect. All you need is a couple of stinking bottom of the keyway tensioners that are basically windshield wiper inserts. And somebody wants 45 grand, and that's the cheapest for the first 1,000 units. That, to me, was a potential point of failure. Luckily, they had the perseverance, and luckily James is also a purchasing agent for a machining company, and he went out and they were able to find these at a fairly reasonable price. Such a simple thing and such a major stumbling block. My goodness. All right, we've looked at the hardware and we looked at the things that you can control, the physical things, but there are other things that, as a Kickstarter, things you just can't control. Things like time. And a perfect example of that is the Kickstarter itself. After the Kickstarter is approved, and they don't advertise this, but once it's approved, it still takes them 6 to 8 weeks to get you your money. So you really can't do anything. I mean, you can't sign any contracts. You can't commit to any major expenditures. You can't buy any equipment or materials, nothing until Kickstarter writes you that check. So right away, right up front, you got a huge delay. There are other things you can do, and I think our guys took advantage of that by doing a redesign of their grip. Another thing, totally out of the blue, a coronavirus doesn't hit every year, but right in the middle of this project, it did. Coronavirus affected a lot of things. It took up a lot of time. A lot of people that were going to be supplying services, that were going to be supplying material, suddenly dried up, and they couldn't find them because it all shut down during the coronavirus, at least initially. Prices during that time just skyrocketed, particularly steel. Most of that comes from overseas. When none of it's being shipped in, or it's all got high tariffs or in place, it's very difficult to find, and when you can find it, you're going to pay very, very premium, and that's what happened here to our SWICK team. The last area is, I'm going to classify this as emotional and psychological stress. And what are you talking about, Bill? Well, okay, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about emotional psychological stress. And I would like to use, at least initially, the small example of this. A lot of you recognize this as a disc detainer pick that lockpicking lawyer and I designed. That's all we did, and that's the easy part. We designed this, we made a couple prototypes on our lathe, and once we got it the way we wanted it, we turned all production over to Sparrows up in Canada, and we donated it. We didn't get paid for it. We got no kickback for it, nothing. Sparrows was going to do the production, and we donated it with the provision that they produce this for the Locksport community at a reasonable price, and they did that. They do all their manufacturing in-house, everything. They don't farm anything out like our SWICK team. It still took them almost a year, mostly due to coronavirus. They were done with the initial pick very quickly, but in order to get the finish on it, they had that is the single thing they subcontracted out, and that was done locally, but the business that did it with the contract closed during coronavirus for 5 months. So there's a 5-month delay that Sparrows had no control over. Let's go over one more example, and this is one of my very early Kickstarters. One of the very first Kickstarters for Locksport was something called Open Locksport by a fellow named Skylar Town. I know him, or knew him personally, a very personable guy, very friendly, very likable, and this guy's a lock genius. He gave talks. He went to all the tool conventions to give presentations. He knew a lot about lock history, or knows a lot about lock history. I talk in the past tense only because I haven't talked to him in several years. He started a Kickstarter with the idea of producing some custom picks for beginning pickers. And he had a Kickstarter that raised, I think it was around $90,000. At the time, it was the second largest Kickstarter ever completed, and very, very successful. To make a long story short, Skylar ran into a lot of the same roadblocks that our SWICK team did. There were things that slowed him down, production. He'd never produced anything. He didn't understand fully the business on how to do it, and things drug out, and over time, his investors started complaining. A lot of them wanted refunds. But more importantly, a lot of them started getting very, very abusive, sending him a lot of hate mail. A lot of found out where he lived. He got swatted. His address was made public. He ended up having to move. Just a real horror story. In Skylar's case, this went on for a period of about 2 years. He ended up having some very serious emotional and psychological issues. The bottom line is, here's a 27-year-old guy who'd won several international lockpicking competitions because of a failed Kickstarter and all the abuse and the negativity spread pretty much by the lock sport community. All right, I know that's a long story, but I want you to understand what happened here. Try to put yourself in the shoes of mostly James and Dave. Christina volunteered her time and didn't invest any of her money. These two guys invested a lot of time and a lot of money. In the end, because of the delays, they ended up getting a lot of hate mail. And the same things that happened to Skylar, the public posting of their home addresses, the abuse on email, the abuse on Reddit, the abuse on some of the other public forums. I can only imagine the emotional and psychological stress that generated for these guys who are doing their best to produce a product for us. When you stack on top of that the fact that they committed themselves and they put their own financial risk and their family's financial future at risk by borrowing money against their homes so they could continue to fund this to get from the pieces to the SWICK. I got to commend them. I just can't imagine why somebody would issue death threats and threats to burn down their houses when they've got $62.50 invested. It's just, to me, I don't understand the nature and the culture of the internet, obviously. Something has gone very, very wrong. Anyway, it's a long story. I'm sorry to keep dragging on, but I thought it would be interesting for you to understand. If you're getting involved in a Kickstarter, if you're thinking about producing some kind of tool, and I hope this was at least a little bit helpful, my tip to you would be do your best guess on your estimate. Get some professionals to help you, some metallurgists or whatever. Get an expert to help you with your estimates. And once you have those estimates, multiply them by 4 and consider that there's every possibility your final cost will be those numbers. And use that to make your go or no-go decision. I appreciate your patience, guys. Sorry to drag this out, but I just felt very strongly that everyone needed to know what went into producing this for us. It's more than just a couple of simple plastic and metal parts. A lot of blood went into these. Thanks, guys.